Last summer, 23-year-old Iryna was riding home on the train when a deranged monster who had been arrested over a dozen times and was released through no cash bail stood up and viciously slashed a knife through her neck and body. Mrs. Zaretsky, tonight I promise you we will ensure justice for your magnificent daughter, Iryna.
To what Ainsley was just referring to, you got that mother. She's bawling because her daughter was brutally murdered on video, and the Democrats don't even stand.
Yeah, Lawrence, this is the stark contrast. They would not stand, the Democrats, for that beautiful young woman, Iryna Zaretsky, who was killed, who was murdered on the subway. And here's the contrast.
A young woman named Iryna is dead. She was 25 years old. She survived a war zone in Ukraine. She did not survive a train ride in the United States. That is a real tragedy. What happened next on the floor of the United States Congress was not grief. It was machinery. Before the speech began, the decision to use Iryna's story had already been made. The mother had been invited, seated, positioned. The language had been written, edited, and rehearsed. The timing of the legislative demand had been sequenced directly after the emotional peak. None of this happened spontaneously in the moment. The production of grief as a political instrument requires planning, and the planning was thorough. What the country witnessed was not a president responding to tragedy, it was a president deploying tragedy. That is the subject of this examination, not the tragedy, the use of it. Those are two entirely different stories, and only one has been told on national television. President Donald Trump stood at the podium during the State of the Union address and introduced Iryna's story to the country. He described in graphic detail how a man stood up on that train and slashed a knife through her neck and body. He then turned directly to her grieving mother in the gallery. He looked at her. He let the room absorb that. And then he immediately pivoted to a legislative demand. He told Congress to pass tough laws ensuring violent repeat offenders stay behind bars.
I'm asking this Congress to pass tough legislation to ensure that violent and dangerous repeat offenders are put behind bars, and importantly, that they stay there.
He gave the room a binary choice: stand and agree or stay seated and explain why. That was not a moment of national mourning. That was a trap, a carefully constructed, professionally staged political trap, and the entire country walked straight into it. Within hours, Attorney General Pam Bondi appeared on national television in her official capacity as the top law enforcement officer in the United States. She was asked about the Democrats who remained seated during that portion of the speech. Her answer was not legal analysis. It was not policy substance. She said that President Trump has made America safe again.
Donald Trump making America safe, and that's why our economy is at a record high. We all know that, and it's safe. And, you know, we also had last night there Andy Wolf, and I've gotten to be very close with his mom, Melody. And you know something else, Ainsley, you'll appreciate this, what President Trump said, what's very different. We are a praying administration.
I loved that.
We all are. Our cabinet prayed before we went out there last night. We prayed for the president, we prayed for Congress, we prayed for the country.
She tied the nation's safety directly to the personal actions of one man. She said the economy is at a record high because of that safety. She said the Democrats would not stand for that beautiful young woman. She defined the opposition not as a political party with a different legislative view, but as people who endorse what happened to Iryna.
We are prosecuting the guy, the monster, and we are seeking the death penalty. That's the stark contrast between Donald Trump Republicans and the Democrats. They refuse to even stand for that victim. It was heartbreaking that Iryna's mother had to experience that. That should be nonpartisan.
Yeah, I appreciated last night not only these touching stories and reasons why.
That is the specific claim now under examination. It is false. The record will demonstrate that it is false, systematically and without ambiguity. Here is what the evidence actually shows. The crime rate in the United States has been in decline for 30 years. 30 years. That trajectory began long before this administration took office. It continued through administrations of both parties, through economic booms and recessions, through periods of aggressive enforcement and periods of reform. No forensic analysis of the available data produces a credible finding that the current administration's specific federal policies caused, accelerated, or are responsible for that long-term statistical trend. The trend existed before the policies. Correlation has not been established. Causation has not been established. The administration deployed personnel across the country for arrests and deportations. The crime rate continued along the same trajectory it was already on. Attorney General Bondi's central factual claim cannot survive contact with the data. Now we move to the specific murder. The forensic record of the case of Iryna Zarutska reveals something the national broadcast did not clarify. The man who murdered her was not an unknown threat. He was a violent repeat offender. He was on the street because of a bail determination made by a local court in North Carolina. A local judge or magistrate examined his record and made the institutional decision to release him without cash bail. That is the decision that directly preceded Iryna's death. That decision was made at the local level by a local official under local jurisdiction. The President of the United States does not write bail schedules for county courthouses in North Carolina. The Attorney General of the United States does not manage pretrial release decisions in state courts. The federal government had no authority over the decision that put that man on that train. That is not opinion. That is a constitutional and jurisdictional fact. The administration is claiming credit for a 30-year crime trend it did not produce, while deflecting blame for a local bail failure it did not control.
The mother of that Ukrainian refuge murdered by that repeat offender out on no cash bail in North Carolina, breaking down into tears last night, the mother was, as you can see, as President Trump promises justice over these senseless murders. And Lawrence, the Dems did not stand up, and Donald Trump said, "How do you not stand?"
Unbelievable. It's true. Attorney General Pam Bondi was there, and she joins us now. Madam Attorney General, thanks so much for joining Fox and Friends this morning. Your immediate reaction.
Both claims are simultaneously false. Both claims are being made on national television by officials whose professional obligations prohibit exactly this kind of misrepresentation. The gap between their obligations and their performance is not subtle. It is the central fact of this broadcast. Now we examine how control was exercised in that chamber. The State of the Union is the single most powerful domestic broadcast in American political life. The president controls the room, the agenda, the timing, and the emotional temperature. He chose to invite Iryna's mother. He chose the specific details he would describe publicly. He chose the moment to make the legislative demand. He chose to force a visible response. The Democrats who remained seated were not endorsing violence. They were refusing to submit to a specific exertion of political control, one that used graphic descriptions of a young woman's death as the lever. The administration understood that the refusal would be photographed, broadcast, and weaponized. The trap worked exactly as designed. The public reaction was immediate and severe. Citizens called the seated Democrats un-American. They called them soulless. They demanded mass removals from office. They directed rage not at the local court that released a dangerous man, but at legislators who did not stand during a televised speech. The administration successfully redirected public fury away from institutional failure and toward political opposition, using a murdered woman as the instrument. That mechanism is worth understanding precisely because it works every time. What makes this particular deployment so effective is its structural completeness. The president did not merely reference a tragedy, he imported the tragedy physically into the room. He seated her mother in the gallery so that every camera angle in the chamber captured a real grieving woman in real time. The emotional weight was not abstract, it was present, it was visible. When he described the graphic details of Iryna's death, the room did not have the psychological space to evaluate the policy logic that followed. The emotional sequencing was deliberate. Overwhelming grief first, legislative demand second, visible compliance expected third. Any deviation from that expected compliance, any decision to sit rather than stand, was already framed as a response to the murdered woman, rather than a response to the political demand that followed her story. The trap had no exit. Stand and you validate the framing. Sit and you become the visual evidence that the framing is true. That is not a moment of legislative debate. That is a controlled detonation, and the administration set the charge weeks before the speech was delivered. The administration does offer a defense. Attorney General Bondi articulates it. She argues that the administration's immigration enforcement and legislative demands are not driven by animus. They are driven by public safety. Her specific supporting argument involves driver licensing for undocumented immigrants. She argues that people who cannot read English road signs should not receive licenses because they may not understand traffic laws, and that a failure to understand those laws could result in fatal crashes. She frames the entire policy position as basic safety, not prejudice. She says critics simply want to call the president racist, but he just loves Americans and wants to protect families. This defense collapses under the facts. The argument that English literacy is a prerequisite for the safe operation of a motor vehicle does not hold up. Millions of licensed drivers in the United States operate vehicles without English as their primary reading language. The road sign system in this country is heavily symbol-based precisely to be universally comprehensible. Beyond that structural problem, the defense is entirely disconnected from the crime it is being used to justify. Iryna Zarutska was not killed in a traffic accident by an unlicensed immigrant who misread a stop sign. She was stabbed on a train by a repeat offender released on no cash bail. The driver's license argument has no logical or factual relationship to her murder. The Attorney General is using a brutal killing to generate emotional justification for a policy that would not have prevented that killing under any scenario. When pressed, she does not address this gap. She pivots. She moves to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. She invokes prayer. She describes the cabinet praying before the speech. These pivots are not rhetorical flourishes. They are evidence of an argument that cannot withstand direct examination. A brief legal clarification is necessary here because the public record shows widespread confusion about how the criminal justice system is structured. The vast majority of violent crimes in this country, including murder and assault, are state offenses. They are investigated by local police. They are prosecuted by local district attorneys. They are adjudicated by state judges. Bail decisions in those cases are made by local magistrates and judges operating under state law. The federal government does not have general police powers. It cannot intervene in a state bail hearing and demand that a suspect be held. The doctrine of judicial immunity, which protects judges from personal liability for decisions made in their official capacity, exists specifically to allow the judiciary to function without political retaliation. Citizens in the public record demanded that the judge who released the suspect be arrested. That impulse is understandable. The grief behind it is real. But the accountability for that bail decision lies entirely within the local court system that made it. What judicial immunity means in practice is that if you want to change how bail decisions are made, you change the law, the policy guidelines, or the personnel of that local court system. You do not arrest the judge for a ruling you disagree with. The moment that protection disappears, every judge in every jurisdiction is subject to criminal liability every time a defendant they released goes on to commit a crime. The entire system of independent judicial review collapses under that standard. This is not a controversial legal position. It is the structural foundation of an independent judiciary. The Attorney General going on national television to imply that federal legislators are responsible for that local decision is a deliberate distortion of how American law operates. And it is a distortion delivered by the person whose professional obligation, above all others, is to ensure the public understands how the law works. We now apply a direct professional judgment to Pam Bondi's performance in her official capacity. She is not a political surrogate. She is the Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Department of Justice. Her professional obligation is to the law, to factual accuracy, and to the public's understanding of how the justice system works. By every measurable professional standard, her televised appearance fails that obligation. She cannot connect the specific murder to any specific federal policy failure. She cannot explain why the driver's license argument is relevant to a stabbing on a train. She cannot explain the jurisdictional boundary between federal and state criminal law when directly discussing a case that illustrates it perfectly. She abandons the factual thread repeatedly and substitutes emotion, partisanship, and religious sentiment. She is not prosecuting a case. She is performing loyalty. Consider what a professionally competent Attorney General appearance on national television would look like in this situation. She would acknowledge the specific jurisdictional failure at the local level. She would describe what federal tools are available and what their limits are. She would explain the difference between federal criminal jurisdiction and state criminal jurisdiction so that the public understands where legitimate reform demands should be directed. She would be honest about what the administration can and cannot control. That is not a difficult standard. That is the baseline professional obligation of the office. Instead, the record shows an official who cannot articulate the jurisdictional boundary between her own department and the local court that made the consequential decision. She uses the death of a young woman to score political points she cannot support with facts. And when the facts are unavailable, she reaches for the Dow Jones in prayer. The Department of Justice under her leadership is not correcting public misunderstanding about institutional accountability. It is amplifying that misunderstanding for political benefit. That is a professional failure of the highest order. measured not against political standards, but against the basic obligations of the office she holds. The expert forensic record supporting this analysis is precise. The 30-year crime decline is documented, quantified, and bipartisan in its trajectory. It appears in FBI data. It appears in independent criminological research. It appears in the records of jurisdictions governed by both parties across 5 presidential administrations. The jurisdictional boundaries between federal and state criminal law are codified in statute and constitutional precedent. The bail failure in the Zarutska case is attributable to a local institutional decision, not federal legislative inaction. The analytical work tracing the administration's use of victims as emotional political leverage is supported by the documented public reaction, which moved exactly as the political machinery was designed to move it. The evidence does not require interpretation. It requires honest presentation. Institutional accountability in this case has 2 distinct addresses. The first is the local courthouse in North Carolina, where a violent repeat offender was assessed and released. That institution failed. Whatever the legal reasoning behind that bail determination, the outcome was catastrophic, and the institution that produced it must be examined, scrutinized, and where appropriate, reformed. The citizens demanding accountability from local courts are pointing at the correct target. Local bail reform is a legitimate policy conversation. It is a conversation that requires examining local statutes, local judicial practices, and local enforcement patterns. It requires the kind of detailed, unglamorous legislative work that does not fit cleanly into a State of the Union address. The second address is the federal executive branch, which took that local failure and transformed it into a national political weapon while deliberately obscuring its own jurisdictional irrelevance. Those 2 failures are not the same failure. They do not share the same cause, and they do not share the same remedy. Conflating them is not an analytical mistake. It is a deliberate strategy. The criminal case against the man who murdered Iryna Zarutska will proceed through the local court system. Evidence will be presented. A verdict will be rendered. A sentence will be determined. The federal government's role in that process will be peripheral at best. In the political arena, the administration will continue deploying victims as evidence of its opponent's moral failures. The opposition will continue to be photographed seated at moments designed to make seated look like complicity. The public will continue to absorb those images before the context reaches them, if the context reaches them at all. The gap between the speed of emotional manipulation and the speed of factual correction is not an accident of the media environment. It is a feature of the strategy. By the time the jurisdictional reality is explained, the outrage has already done its work. The mechanisms of the law move slowly and with precision. The mechanisms of political exploitation move fast and without precision by design. One system is built to find truth, the other is built to avoid it. Iryna Zarutska deserved the first system applied to her death. What she received on a national broadcast was the second. Before we close, one quick clarification. Everything examined in this script is drawn from publicly available information, documented statements, official broadcasts, and forensic data present in the source record. This is not a call to any political action. It is not an endorsement of any party, candidate, or legislative position. The facts of the Zarutska case are real and tragic, and nothing in this analysis diminishes the grief of her family. Reasonable people examining the same record may reach different conclusions about the administration's intentions, the appropriate policy response, or the Democrats' decision to remain seated. What is not subject to reasonable disagreement is the jurisdictional record of American law, the 30-year trajectory of the national crime rate, or the factual circumstances of the bail decision that preceded Iryna's murder. Those are documented. If this analysis raises questions you want to examine further, the comments are open. The evidence is available. Engage with it carefully and share this with someone who will.